Welcome to Unleashed Learning TV and Unleashed Learning Radio for our podcast listeners. Now, if you're a school leader working to make learning stick for everyone, even during disruptive times, this episode is so for you. Now, Dr. Peter Dewitt is a leadership coach and author of many best-selling educational books, including Instructional Leadership, Collaborative Leadership, Collective Leadership, and his latest book, De-Implementation. He's here to answer the big leadership questions so that you can lead in a way that makes learning stick for everyone, no matter what. Peter, welcome to Unleashed Learning TV. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, William. It's good to be here.
From one side of the world to the other, New York to Sydney, we're glad you're here. So as you know, we work with schools and businesses, but for this conversation, we're talking about schools, and we help to make learning stick for everyone. And to do that, we work with new teachers, current teachers, and the leaders. And as you probably know, the leaders are going through a time of massive disruption. And so what we wanted to do is focus this conversation with your expertise on leadership to see if we can offer some additional ways to support those leaders during these crazy times we're living in.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll do what I can.
So I thought we'd start with the big questions. I've read your book on my Kindle, they're on here. I wanted to start from the difference between being a leader who's a manager and a leader that's an instructional leader. What's the difference between those two?
For me, it's fairly simple. It's actually instructional leadership is just about focusing on learning. The differentiation is the simple part. The task of doing it is the difficulty. And I think sometimes there's this dualistic thinking that goes on, that you're supposed to practice instructional leadership and management is bad. And I don't particularly agree with that. I think that both are very necessary. I was a school principal for 8 years. And I think you have to find a balance between management and instructional leadership. Management is, of course, going to be some of the tasks. It's going to be personnel. It's going to be meeting with parents. It's going to be, accountability measures. Sometimes what district wants you to do. And then the other side, the instructional leadership side, is, when you start considering things like learning walks and walkthroughs and flipped faculty meetings and just how you engage in discussions around learning. And I find that school principals have a very difficult time doing it, and it's kind of complicated, but instructional leadership is the most researched form of school leadership over the past 50 years. And we haven't gotten a lot better at doing it because the management tasks that we've been assigned to do have actually increased over the past 20 years. And I was reading research from Scandinavia, like from the 1990s, that showed that sometimes principals were actually plucked out of the classroom, not because they were really good teachers, but because they were actually good at management. In some cases, they weren't good teachers at all, but they were good at management. So, that's a piece that also complicates. And then, of course, we have the whole idea of self-efficacy. What we know from the research is that if you feel confident talking about learning and content, then you're going to double your efforts. But if you don't feel confident talking about it, you're going to slacken your efforts. And that's where you're going to focus on management. And we know that management also feels good. It's it's something that you can write a list and you can check off the box for everything you do. So you leave every day almost feeling like you accomplished something. Instructional leadership is a little bit more difficult than that because of it's a discussion and those kind of things.
It makes me think about, probably in this time of disruption, which of those buckets are we focusing on? Maybe one is a little bit, I don't want to say easier to focus on, but that's a great way of explaining the complexity of the work as a leader. So I loved in the book, one of the things I liked a lot was the term, you talked about in collaborative leadership, this politics of distraction. I think that, I'm at a lot of schools, there's a lot of politics of distraction. So, and then we've got disruptive times. So how, as leaders, instructional leaders, managers, the combination of two, how do we limit the politics of distraction and ensure learning is the focus, especially right now?
That's a very difficult question. So I should, first and foremost, politics of distraction, that whole name and that citation actually came from John Hattie. And John and I have been working together for a long time now, well, since late 2013. And it was actually the first paper that he asked me to edit and give him feedback on, which was a very intimidating process on my side. But he asked me to read this this paper that he was writing and publishing, and it was called The Politics of Distraction. And I thought it was fantastic because he really talked about the fact that schools don't always focus on learning. And that's where, that part comes from. When I looked at John's research back then, and then of course, my mindset was still very new because I had taken a leave of absence from being a school principal. So technically I was still in the school principal role. I think that balance can be very difficult. I remember one time Michael Follen, we were together in New Zealand, and he said, just because you're stuck with their policies doesn't mean you need to be stuck with their mindset. And I will never forget that. In fact, I created a book series for Corwin, my publisher, and Michael wrote one of the books, and I asked him to put that in there. What it means is that you have to look at some spaces where you can accomplish both. So we know that we've got top-down initiatives that are coming at us, and we have to do a better job. And I was guilty of this as well. So we have to do a better job of seeing where some of those initiatives actually fit into the greater good of student engagement, instructional strategies, and those kind of things. Sometimes what we find is that when we feel like something is being pushed out on us, that we're instantly resistant to it. In fact, I have a new book that came out about a month ago on de-implementation, about abandoning low-value practices. And when I was doing the research behind that, I would ask people, what do you want to de-implement? What would you get rid of? Every single one. And I did this with like thousands of people through workshops and webinars and everything else. Every single one said they talked about something that they felt like was being done to them, as opposed to something they had control over. That leads to the other part of what I wanted to say is when you're looking at the politics of distraction and something you have control over, we do have control over things like our faculty meetings. When I was a school principal, and I wrote about this in collaborative leadership, and I've certainly written about it in other areas as well, but my staff, and I didn't have assistant principals or anything like that. It was us together. And I remember we went through this one pretty terrible time when we had millions of dollars of budget cuts, and we were consolidating a school building, and I was absorbing the whole population. And my staff were saying that we had low morale. So I did an activity, because often we hear low morale and we think it's our fault, and it's not. Low morale is all of us, how we speak. If we say something positive, that contributes to a much more positive morale. If we talk about kids or parents in the faculty room, that contributes to negative morale and low morale. So we did this activity, and what really came out is the number one reason they didn't feel like they was contributing to low morale is they didn't feel like they had a voice in their own learning. So I said, but we do, and that's a flipped faculty meeting idea. And this was like 2011 when I did this. So we talked about what we wanted to learn together. What is it as a staff that we valued? What do we want to learn together? And the first thing we talked about was feedback. So I found an article, sent it out a few days before the faculty meeting. Everybody knew it was coming, they communicated it well. And then they brought examples of the feedback that they actually gave to students. We can still do those things, even with the politics of distraction. I know that we have complicated times. We've all lived through complicated times. But it's about making sure that we try to focus some of our efforts on what it is we do value. Now, what makes that complicated is that if a principal or a school leader doesn't feel terribly credible when it comes to talking about learning, then they're probably not going to flip their faculty meeting because they don't feel like they're confident enough to be able to do that. In my role, I felt confident to do that. In fact, I went from teaching for 11 years to being a principal, and my staff actually, during the interview process, they actually chose me because I had a teaching background. So when we're looking at the politics of distraction, it really is about compartmentalizing. Where is a space where we have to be able to do this? And where are those other spaces that we have the freedom to actually engage in conversations about learning? I went to every classroom every morning and say good morning to the kids. I went back into classrooms for about an hour each day. I made sure that I set that in my schedule. I mean, I literally had a calendar thing that would go off and say, get out of your office. So sometimes we have to do that. And I certainly do that with people I'm coaching. I tell them to put it in your calendar, but it's also that flipped faculty meeting idea. It's about understanding where the connections are. Too often when I'm working with leaders, they look at observations, faculty meetings, their instructional leadership team as different isolated incidents. I didn't do that because conceptually we should be talking about learning in all of them. So what we talk about at the faculty meeting should be tied into what we're talking about when we're doing learning walks and walkthroughs and formal observations, and what we value as an instructional leadership team or a principals advisory team. So I would say that's a long-winded answer for your question, but the reality is I think there's space to be able to do both, and that's what great leadership is. I mean, like, I was working with a group in Manitoba this morning, and one of the things that I said is, if times are really easy, then it's easy to find instructional leadership and put that focus. But when you have a complicated time, or as you call it, a disruptive time, that's where you can actually find your best leadership skills. I would say that during the most challenging times I experienced as both a teacher and a principal were the times that I actually found my greatest leadership. And those are the kind of things that you can do. So hopefully that answered your question.
It just reminds me too, like what we do at Unleashed Learning is that system in place so that when these initiatives come in, things go into that system rather than jumping all around. And you're talking about what leaders really are during times of disruption from a learning and leadership perspective. So I think it's fantastic. So I want to ask this question. One of our core values at Unleashed Learning is equity and inclusion, and it's woven through everything we do. And a lot of the schools we work with, probably most of them, that's one of their core values as well. So what are some things that we need to know about ourselves? I know your first book was really around equity and inclusion, my doctoral work. So what are some things, a lot of times it's about what they have to do for other people, but what do we need to know about ourselves as leaders if equity and inclusion is core values, especially during these times of disruption?
Yeah, we have to understand our blind spots. I mean, so I did my doctoral research in how well school administrators in New York State safeguard LGBTQ students. And then that became my first book for Corwin. Over the years, it's been very interesting because I would have thought that book would be completely irrelevant because I wrote it in 2011, 2012. And sadly, at least in the United States, it's still completely relevant. In fact, in the past year, I've actually been banned from having a conversation about some of those topics in certain states around the US, which doesn't bode well for me. I don't like being banned because I don't find myself to be particularly controversial. I think one of the things that I've learned about myself, though, is even though people look to me as a very inclusive guy because I focused on those things, I write the Finding Common Ground blog for Education Weeks. I've talked about social emotional learning and inclusion, equity, and all that stuff. I didn't realize, though, that I still had biases. I still had blind spots. I created a show for Ed Week 2 years ago called The Seat at the Table. And I created it with my editor, Elizabeth Rich. And we talk a lot about race and equity. And there were a couple of things, William, that was very interesting to me. And I don't know if I've ever said this before. So one of the, at least in public, there were a couple of things. Number one, I remember the second interview I did was with Zaretta Hammond, and we were talking about cultural responsiveness. And I remember I asked a question, I don't even remember what the question was, but at the very beginning, my implicit bias clearly came out. And I remember Zaretta, who I know, just looked and said, wait a minute, let's unpack what you just said. And I was like, oh no. And this was my second show ever. There's a chat box going. There were people saying, Peter's getting an education now. I emailed Zaretta months after that and just said it was one of the best learning experiences that I had had because I clearly asked some questions that showed a white bias that I had, right? And I didn't see it. And she was able to call it out, not in a rude way, she just called it out. And that made me rethink a lot of my questions as I went forward. What I know about things like self-efficacy and confidence is that people don't feel comfortable doing that, especially on camera on a show. And to me, it doesn't bother me as much. Like for that was a catalyst for me to engage in those conversations around race and equity over the past 2 years, much, much more than I probably was doing before. And I'm okay if I'm not saying the right thing. And I value when the guest on the show is correcting me, because I think that's a good learning lesson for me. There are a lot of leaders that don't necessarily feel like that. So one of the first parts, I think, what leaders have to know about themselves is they have to be okay with being wrong. They have to be okay with saying the wrong thing. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and because I did pride myself on being so inclusive, is that when we started to look for guests on the show, what I found is that I knew a lot of white people. And so what it had sort of inspired me to do is look within all of my circles, look at, I'm a consulting editor for Corwin, so I help design the leadership line. I have the show, I have guest bloggers that do stuff for my Education Week blog. And what I really, over the past couple of years, have also had to look at is, why is it that I'm talking about inclusion and equity, and yet I don't seem to have a lot of diversity in the people that I could readily have come on the show? And over the past 2 years, that has exploded for me. So from that standpoint too, I think people have to be able to look within themselves and also look at, who are your connections? What do they look like? And I'm not just talking about diversity from race. I'm talking about diversity of thought. In the United States, it's no big secret. We're very polarized. And what often happens there is, if you're on that side, then don't talk to me anymore, that kind of stuff. So when we're talking about equity and inclusion, we also have to talk about the equity and inclusion of thinking, right? Of diverse ideas. And I think we have to look within ourselves to understand if we are comfortable with having those conversations. And if we're not, why are we not comfortable with having those conversations? So I think that's a part of it too. So it's a really big, that's a huge question for me, because it's certainly been a journey that I've been on, from going from thinking that I knew a lot about the topic, to having my eyes open to not knowing enough, to wanting to jump in and dive in head first and be able to go deeper into all this and learn, but also to look at the fact that it's not just about when we're talking about equity and inclusion, it's also about the diverse thinking that we have within our schools as well, and be able to have open conversations. I know, in Australia, I sit on an advisory board with Helen Timperley and Russell Bishop, two people that I admire very much. And Russell has done a great deal of work with Aboriginal students and Maori students in New Zealand. So it's also about that cultural piece that I think we have to, when we're looking, it's not just the equity and inclusion we're comfortable with, it's also about the ones that we're not talking about. And I'll give you one last example and then I'll stop. But I'm doing this statewide work in Washington State in the US. And one of our guest speakers was talking about inclusion and equity, but never mentioned the LGBTQ community. And it was very interesting to me, because I think that when we're listening, who are we leaving out of the conversation too, right? So that's, those are all the parts that we have to be able to discuss if we're really going to do equity and inclusion well.
It just reminds me over and over again, what you're talking about is leadership's an inside out job.
Yeah, it is.
That kind of reflective practice. So we're in disruption and chaos, but that doesn't change. That process doesn't change. And the vulnerability that is part of that, and that continuous learning and willing to be wrong. And also hopefully having some critical allies who can tap you on the shoulder and go, hey, and I've had a lot of tap it on the shoulder, go, hey, William, and go, whoa, I didn't, right? And so we do that for each other. So it's who's around us, the reflective process. And also what I heard you say is, what am I willing to see? What do I see?
What are you willing to learn? Back to your original question about instructional leadership, I find that sometimes leaders think instructional leadership is about knowing it all when they're walking in, and that's just not how I operate. I think instructional leadership is about, what are you willing to learn when you go into situations? What are you willing to learn when you go into classrooms? Even those classrooms that you might have an implicit bias. We have walkthrough biases, right? Like we're going into a classroom of a content that we taught that, so you go in with well, that's not how I used to teach it.
Yeah.
So like that whole idea of leadership is about, what are you willing to learn about yourself, and what are you willing to learn from the other people that you're surrounded with? You don't always have to have that status, and it doesn't always have to be the top down, you need to learn from me. It's what can we learn from one another? I think that's really important too.
That's fantastic. So I want to, maybe the final question is going to be tone, because you were alluding to that. And I want to talk about, from a leadership perspective, we set the tone. We're part of the ways we set the tone, right? We're not the only ways. And in this time of disruption and chaos and really uncertainty for a lot of people, what are some ways leaders can help set, I'm hesitant for positive tone, but I want to use that positive tone, a hopeful tone, a productive tone, especially when all this stuff is going on?
Yeah, there are a lot of things. I remember my last year of teaching, I worked for a principal who used to check our lesson plans every 3 to 4 weeks. And I always had them done. It didn't mean I did anything that was actually written in them, but I had them done. And I remember I forgot to hand them in one time. And I went up to her on the stairwell and I said, I'm really sorry I forgot to hand these in last night. And she said, oh, I never check yours anyway. And I remember just thinking, then why am I handing them in? And as a school principal, I didn't do that. Like, I'm not going to send out an email to the whole entire staff when it's a couple of people that I have the issue with. I need to be able to talk with them face to face, right? And not in a mean way, but in a caring way. Todd Whitaker taught me that many years ago. But I also think it's about when people are coming into the school, what are they seeing? When they see us as school leaders, are we seemingly like happy to see them? Because I worked for principals that, depending on the day, they were looking pretty angry, and I just wanted to stay out of their way. And I wanted to make sure that as a school principal, when people were walking in, I treated them with respect because I deeply cared about the fact that they're there. It did not mean that every day was a glorious day. It wasn't. But I think we set the tone by how we welcome people into school every day. Going into every classroom to say good morning to the kids, that was just my way of making sure that they saw me as not just a disciplinarian, but as a person that they can see. And that was a daily, you have to make sure you're doing that all the time. I did stuff like I studied the yearbook so I could get to know the names of the kids. I got hired 3 months before I officially started. So I studied the yearbook and I knew the adults' names by the time I started. I used to go over after school, once a week. But also when we're looking at things like faculty meetings, when we're looking at things like instructional leadership team meetings, one of the things that I've done over the past few years is not just, it's always important to have success criteria, right? We talk about that with kids. So I always have success criteria for the content that I'm going to teach when I'm running a workshop. But what I never considered until a few years ago was, what about the success criteria of the people that were in the room? So whenever I'm coaching, it might be a 16 to 90 minute session, or whenever I'm running a workshop, or even when I'm giving a keynote and we're talking, over 1,000 people could be in the room, I not only share the success criteria that I have for them so they know why they're there, but I also use Mentimeter, which is an online engagement tool that's anonymous. And I ask them for their success criteria. How are you going to know when you left here today, when you leave a meeting with me, that this was actually a successful time? From an instructional leadership team meeting, it's very important because there are people sitting around the table that might not particularly know why they're there. But for me, from a workshop standpoint, it's been a way to really get a connection with, oh, that's what they value. That's what they want to learn about today. How can I infuse that into what I'm already doing? And I think when we're looking at developing that school climate, we have to be comfortable with going into, say, a faculty meeting or going into a leadership team meeting and developing success criteria together with the people around the table. Now, I'm not going to say that it's easy to do at first. I find when I started to do it, or when I work with, I have a lot of long-term people that I work with, but when I first started to do it with organizations or schools, some of it would be very surface level, and that was okay because it was a start. As time went on, I saw that their thoughts got a lot deeper and a lot deeper. So that, I think, also helps. It's not only the climate piece with what people see when they come in, knowing their names when they're there, treating them with respect, but it also involves every meeting that we're a part of where we actually elevate their voices. One of the quotations that I have been saying for years, and I will always say it, and I think I said in collaborative leadership first, was, I think leadership is when you walk into a meeting with one idea, but you walk out with a better one. It's not walking into a meeting with one idea and walking out with the same one. Because walking into a meeting with one idea and walking out with a better one is collaboration. Walking into a meeting with an idea and walking out with the same one is control. Yeah. And I think those are the things that, and success criteria and developing it with the people we work with certainly helps with that too.
As we close this, it makes me think a lot of the things I'm hearing you talk about is also values, because you have, as a leader, and I'm assuming the people listening and watching this will think the same thing for their own work, but there's values associated with the work. So the things you're describing for the tone and the climate goes back to our values, which connects back to who we are as human beings rather than just the stuff we know. It's what we value, that kind of reflective practice, who we want to be. And also made me think finally about that piece is that being a leader is actually being a learner as well, right? Rather than driving it through, you're talking about from a learning perspective. So, well, Peter, I know it's later in the day for you in New York.
Thank you. Yes.
It's early in the morning for me, but I really appreciate this conversation. You've written so many books about leadership. We've asked some bigger questions, not bigger questions, but some surrounding questions from that during this disruptive time. And thank you so much for the work you do for so many.
Well, William, thank you for asking me to be on. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Peter. We look forward to talking to you soon.
All right, same here.
Now we want to hear from you. We want to know, what's your one key leadership takeaway from Peter's discussion? Please jump over to the comments section and join the conversation. And remember, our free ebook is there. So if you don't have a copy, grab it now. And we hope it helps in the ways you make learning stick for everyone.